It seems in some ways that in politics we talk about independence. In business, we talk about disruptors. Are we in an age of disruption?
This is a disruptive time in politics. I think that's absolutely true. Politics has surprised me because of how much joy I have got from it. People do have rusted on views, but I think if you talk to them, most people, a lot of people are a bit more open-minded than you think. You can persuade.
How much do you worry about the algorithm? How much do you worry that we are losing our ability to engage outside of our bubbles?
I worry a lot about that. I think we all need a moment to break from that. And I think we need to do more in real life. We need to be able to sit down and disagree and listen to each other and come away with empathy and respect. And if we can do that, then we are stronger. When it comes to it, however, like being empathetic and vulnerable is great, but you actually have to keep people safe. And that's what I mean. You have to be strong and soft. Like, we do need protections. Sometimes I would just go and hang out in the bathroom until like the formal bit started, because I was so nervous about going up to groups of people, introducing myself and feeling like I just had nothing to contribute.
StoryWork is brought to you in partnership with Slingshot. Slingshot are Australia's creative media experts, and having worked successfully with them for years, I'm thrilled to have them on board.
You're listening to a DM podcast.
Well, hi friends, my name is Matt Jones and welcome to another episode of StoryWork. This might be your first time, in which case it's great to have you here, or you might have already listened to some fantastic conversations I've been having with Don Pym, with Zali Steggall, and most recently with Michael McQueen. Now, Michael McQueen, I just want to note, is an incredible thinker about change, how to deal with change and how to drive change. If you haven't heard that episode, go back and have a listen. It is full of practical advice and insight. And it sets up this conversation with the amazing Allegra Spender really perfectly. Before Allegra became an independent federal MP, she said she used to worry she was too privileged for politics, or perhaps she was too reserved, too introverted for the campaign trail. In fact, she shares with us that her own father very gently tried to persuade her to take a different path. But she finds herself in Canberra trying to drive that change we talked about, and in particular, trying to drive change around tax reform. We spoke shortly after the federal budget. It came on the back of months of campaigning by Allegra for Australia to have a serious and grown-up discussion about the future of our tax system. Something tells me that that conversation is only just getting started, and also that Allegra Spender herself is only just getting started. So talking of which, let's start the podcast and welcome Allegra Spender to StoryWork. So Allegra, I chatted to you before we recorded this. I was saying, I think it was 21 years ago, I was sitting around in a London think tank called Policy Exchange, and I was writing a sort of recommendation paper on tax reform.
Oh, God.
And then I sort of lived this completely frivolous life where I end up, building brands and creating a gin business. Whereas you are now in the middle of the Canberra storm, driving, the agenda and the narrative on tax reform to the extent where it feels like the government has picked up the baton, and we'll talk about how much they've got it right and how much they've got it wrong. But where were you 21 years ago while I was trying to pretend to be a grown-up, just briefly?
I was actually also in the UK. I was working for a big London teaching hospital, and I was working in sort of change management about how do you help improve the outcomes for patients, both their own experience and also their medical outcomes, without increasing costs. And there are actually lots of ways you can do that in really positive ways that also improve experience for staff. But that's what I was doing, because I loved public policy, but I wanted to see it, on the ground.
So this podcast is called StoryWork, and the thing I wanted to interrogate was the role that story plays in growing things, whether it's growing a business or growing a career or growing a country. Tell me a bit about that work you're doing in the hospital. What was the story of your professional career to that point? What was the story you were telling yourself about what I do and where I'm heading?
Yeah, it's funny I think this is really important because we can tell ourselves stories that hold us back, and we can tell ourselves stories that can move us forward, and as well as the stories we tell externally. I grew up in a family where I worked in business, from the age of like 11 or 12. So business was like kind of core to me. But I also grew up, I'll be honest, in a fair amount of privilege, which I was pretty aware of. And I was like, look, I want to make a positive contribution to the world. And I think that, I'd like more people to enjoy some of the privileges I've had, like a great education, a really supportive family, all those things. And so that kind of drew me to public policy. And so why I ended up in a hospital was I did some work I started work at McKinsey, and then I worked for UK Treasury. But because I'd spent all this time in business, I wanted to see stuff on the ground. I wanted to see how things actually move rather than how they theoretically move. And that's what kind of drew me to say, how do you make change happen on the ground, not just in theory? So that's kind of how I ended up in that hospital.
At what point did you start to think that the change you wanted to make in the world would need to involve you getting into politics? So you've described this sort of building this. I often see it as like a professional muscle, and this kind of muscle where you go, okay, I'm someone who looks at lived experience, but I'm also someone who brings lenses, and you obviously had the famously analytical kind of McKinsey lens of improving the world and improving how things work. But lenses have to be applied to a problem to create positive impact. At some stage, you start to think, maybe I need to take my skill set into politics. Do you remember that point? Do you remember that trigger?
To be honest, I wouldn't have done it had I not been approached. And the reason is, my dad was a politician. So I did think about when I was a kid, you sort of think, oh, your parents do this, maybe this is what I do. And then I looked at politics, particularly as I was growing up, and I thought they all behave like idiots. It looks incredibly aggressive. I don't think I've got a thick skin enough to do it, and I don't know what party I would join because I don't like any of them. And so I never thought genuinely I would get into politics. I just didn't think it was a possibility. And really was being approached to say, well, would you consider running as an independent? And then this sense that maybe there's a version of doing politics that actually is consistent with who I am. Maybe there's a version out there, and that's what I decided to try. So that's kind of my kind of launching point was to say, okay, I might not be successful, but let me give it a shot and do this in a way that is authentic to, I guess, how I see the world. My dad, who was a politician, and he wrote me this email, and I still have it. It's like an email from 3:00 in the morning, and it gives me a list of, darling, I'm just not sure you should do this. And it came from a big place of love, but it was like, here are the 20 reasons why I think what you're doing is crazy, not just being an independent, but also going into politics. And so, there were lots of people, who questioned it.
It seems in some ways that in politics we talk about independence. In business, we talk about disruptors. Are we in an age of disruption? Whether you look at whether it's, Macron in France and the En Marche movement, sometimes some disruptive movements that are outsiders that are maybe less positive, others that are more positive and progressive. But are we in a sort of a golden age? Are we at the end of that phase, or are we just at the beginning of a phase of the rise of disruptive, non-aligned independence? What's your sense of that direction of travel?
This is a disruptive time in politics. I think that's absolutely true. Now, whether what forms that takes, we've got reform in the UK, you've got, as you say, En Marche in France, we have One Nation resurging again. So as well as the independence here in Australia. So I think we are at a time of disruption. The world is disrupted. Like, this is a time of enormous change and evolution. And I read this book, What We Owe the Future, which is actually a fabulous book. It sort of tries to take like a 10,000-year view on how to be good now for our ancestors. And one of the things it talks about is that there are times in history which are fluid, and there are times in history which are less fluid. And I think we are at a fluid time, certainly in Australian politics.
I briefly worked as a political advisor in the UK, and one of my frustrations, I would say I had a 100% losing track record because I only worked in opposition, which is, you're going well. But I really disliked that term opposition. I always felt like what voters wanted was alternatives. They wanted alternative voices and alternative perspectives. I'm interested, as you started to get into the world of politics and sort of try on this new job and as an independent, what was the gap between what you thought politics would be about and what it actually turned out to be about?
So I always say that politics has surprised me because of how much joy I have got from it. And I know that seems like an unusual word to use. So you have these moments where you help people and you give joy. And I didn't think I would enjoy it as much as I do. Actually, standing on the street corner in Bondi Junction as I was last week, listening to people's feedback on sort of, government policy and other policy. And, again, I think most of the time I'm come away going, people are pretty reasonable. We may end up having different views in the world, but there are many, many good people in Australia. So on that side of things, there's a lot of upside. I thought politics, however, would be more debate and more contest of ideas. And I think, parliamentary debate is desperately, I think, disappointing, even from a low expectations. And, it feels like most parliamentary speeches are literally just filling the time and, doing clips for social media. So I kind of think there's not a real exchange in Parliament. There's some exchange and question time, but there's no real exchange of ideas, certainly in the chamber itself. And I think that's disappointing.
That just resonates. That's given me a bit of PTSD, because I remember one of my early mentors in the UK said, Matt, the problem with politicians is they're all fucking lawyers. And so they all think in these sort of procedural terms and these game playing terms, and I'm going to push this motion and do this and we're going to get a win. And he said, but the problem is they think as if the voters are a jury and the doors are locked and they have to keep listening while they stride around the chamber and thump the desk. But the reality is the voters are gone. They stopped listening hours ago, days ago, years ago. And this just doesn't win people over. And so to your point, as a result, we don't end up with a contest of genuine ideas and thinking. It's just this sort of game being played in Westminster, in my experience, or Canberra in yours.
Yeah. Look, I think what I find most disappointing in politics is, I guess, the personal attacks and also the failure to engage with the real issues. And I think most people I speak to get really pissed off with that too, because I think they say, look, we don't want to hear who's to blame. We would like to understand what the constructive solutions are. We would like you to stop talking about each other. We would like you to start talking about us. And I think that's the gap. It's talking about what matters to people, why people are worried, rather than the politics around who's saying what and why this person is disagreeing or not.
I was thinking before this chat about the journalist and commentator Walter Lippmann, and he was the guy who coined the phrase the Cold War, and I think he was really interested in this notion of framing and how he looked at the world and went, the world it is not patronizing to think that the world is just too complex and too detailed for most people to be taking in all of that detail all of the time. So what all of us naturally do is we sort of construct a worldview, we construct a lens, and then we add new bits of information to that. To what extent have you found that something that you've had to sort of wrestle with, that everyone you are trying to persuade comes to every issue with quite a sort of rusted on worldview and perspective? So you've got to not just offer your alternative, but sort of meet them where they are.
I think that people do have rusted on views, but I think if you talk to them, most people, a lot of people are a bit more open-minded than you think. You can persuade. I don't know what the percentage is, but people are persuadable if you bother to engage with them and really understand what's going on for them. So I think that is important. I do think, however, probably something I have struggled with is, really, it's not dumbing down, but trying to extract the core of what you're trying to do or say into something that is very short, because people do have many other things in their lives than they're worrying about. They want you to worry about the detail. They want to sort of know things at a principles level. And so, while you may rail against the Tony Abbott kind of, 3-word slogans, it is effective, and you can't just rail against it. You actually need to have a response to that. So I think that's how I think about, that's a big challenge in politics, and it's, I think, a big challenge in communication more broadly. You have to stand for something consistently, and people need to be able to instinctively respond to that, as well as want to get into the detail with you. There's
a choice though, isn't there? I mean, as I'm listening to you, I'm thinking about a lot of the coaching and advising I do with startup founders, because they will sit, and we're going to talk a little bit about investment and venture capital in a minute, but they will sit across the desk from a venture capitalist that I mentor at StartMate, and they'll take their cohorts over to San Francisco and meet Sequoia and all these kind of big names. And the VCs will say, look, no fluff. We just get straight to your numbers and show me your recurring revenue and all these things. But I'll say to them, well, I'm not sure that's always great advice, because sometimes the way we cut through is we tell a story. We reveal more of ourselves by telling a story about how we see the world. And by doing that, we create this moment of connection, empathy. So talking of choices, I remember when the first kind of teal insurgency happened, there was very much this strong association with the need to deal with climate change and sort of bring some proper effective action on environment. You have clearly now, and I'm not suggesting you have left that behind, but you've clearly made tax reform and the need to address the way that our tax system works or potentially does not work for people. You've really made that a centerpiece of your agenda. When did that become something that you decided this is going to be a real signature for me?
It's actually pretty early on in the first year of my first term, because it was an area where I think it's really hard, and I think, we're having a massive debate about it at the moment, and I think it's because it is really hard, and also because no one was talking about it then. And so I sort of said, okay, well, fine. If nobody's talking about it, it's hard but important, and it is actually about setting us up as a country where we need to go, then it is the place that someone like me as an independent can play a really important role, because I can say things and put things on the table and start a conversation that others can't. And so certainly I feel like we've started a conversation. We've got both major parties talking about it at the moment. And my goal is really to help land on something constructive.
Because if you're trying to raise funding for policy research and design, it's much easier to get people animated around healthcare or education, because these things matter. But actually this sort of foundational DNA of our society being how we bring money in and then how we spend it again. And do we as a society slightly undervalue that conversation? Does it just exhaust us? Is it too technical?
I think it's technical. I think people feel people are worried about it because it hits them personally. They don't feel particularly competent or informed by it, because most people don't actually spend that much time focused on their tax. And so they, if you ask them how much tax you pay and what's your average tax rate, most people would not know probably, because we all focus on the other things in our lives that are really important. And so I think it is, I think those are, and it does, and this goes to broader economic policy. We can talk about, again, another one, sort of regulation and red tape. Those are things I've really spent a lot of time focused on as well. That's not going to get people out of bed going, yay. But, we do actually in this country need to make it easier for people to grow and start businesses. We have put lots of well-meaning regulation in that makes things more complicated than it should be. And that's problematic. And sometimes that regulation just serves vested interests as well. So I think these are some of the challenges of the sort of unsexy parts of public policy that aren't going to get people kind of super excited, but often just on the negative, but which are in general terms really important.
It's challenging, isn't it? Sort of, it's a little bit like eat your greens and take your medicine. Sometimes you're like, look, this conversation really affects you. I need to engage you with it. But the reality is, a good day is a day that you don't think about tax. Like for normal people, for all of us, not just normal. I'm reasonably normal, I suppose. So let's talk about, we're recording this in the shadow of the recent federal budget. Maybe let's start with the positives. What, from your personal sort of your wish list, what made it into the budget? What immediately gave you a sense of this is progress, this is movement forward?
Look, it's probably not. There are lots of things in the budget which I like or dislike, so I don't want to. But let's talk on tax, and I'm going to, do. This is what I think has been missing probably in the debate. Is going to start with why. And again, this is probably the other thing I've learned on tax and actually public policy, and frankly, in the same in business as well. Why is this important? Why do I believe the tax system actually needs some reform? And I'll sort of say three things. Firstly, we tax people most when they're youngest, less well off, and least able to pay, when they have the highest HEX debts, when they're most likely to be renting, when they're most likely not to have money, because we tax wages more than we tax CGT or sort of capital gains. We tax, certainly we tax super. So what we're doing is we have a front-loaded tax system, actually compared to most countries, we also don't tax consumption pretty a lot, which also would get people more smoothly. So we have a tax system that's very front-loaded. I think that doesn't make a lot of sense. Second problem with the tax system is, our tax system is very heavily focused on wages. we have an aging population. And, I don't mean to be a pessimist, but I do believe that AI is going to disrupt our economy somewhat, and that may mean some impact on jobs in the short term, which will hurt us. And so I think we need a tax base that is more resilient to an aging population, particularly where we now have, just to give you a couple of stats, 2 families on 100 grand, a retired family pays half the tax on average as a working age family. 27% of retired Australians used to pay income tax. Now it's 17%. And the wealth of older Australians has gone up by around 50% in the decade to 2016, compared to households under the age of 35, where it basically didn't move. So those are 3 problems. Those are 3 examples of where I believe the tax system isn't working, and how it's playing out. And then the third piece is that we know that young people's ability to build wealth and build financial security has really fallen behind. Now, a big part of that is house price increases. And we know that a lot of that house price increase, it has gone to older and wealthier Australians. So that's the challenges we've got in the system at the moment. And then the question is, well, what can you do? You can't reverse these things. There are many challenges with the system, and there are many reasons why, for instance, capital is taxed less than labour, and we do need to be internationally competitive on things like capital gains tax and attracting investment, et cetera, et cetera. But those are the problems. So therefore I go to, well, where's the government trying to go? Well, I'll say where I was trying to go is lower income tax rates, and then pay for that by reducing concessions on CGT, negative gearing, and sort of trusts, because I thought you could sort of balance those things out. I think the government eventually is planning to lower income tax rates, but hasn't done it up front, which I think is a mistake and has made their life much harder than it should be. But also, I think then they're now trying to reduce some of those concessions. And then I go to the devil's in the detail, because the question is, firstly, should you do it? I think in principle, yes. Then how you do it, you can do it in ways that are really good and, good for the economy and good for fairness, and ways that are not. And I think at the moment we're going through the unpicking of what the government's proposed to say, okay, where is it good? Where is it not? And that's kind of where I'm at the moment, is that kind of really in the detail stuff. Okay, this bit's not. So yeah, so I'm kind of like, I support the principle of trying to reduce taxes on wages and paying for that by reducing tax concessions in other areas. But you need to get that detail right. And I think that's the job of now.
And it's interesting listening to you talk about the principles. You've just articulated more clearly in 5 minutes there the principles that should underpin the evolution and the reform of the tax system than in many ways has come across through the budget, where I feel there's so much noise around the detail, and clearly not all of that detail is right. So how do we then strike that balance between taking the time and having the patience to go into the depth versus deal with this world that just requires us to say quickly and succinctly up front, this is what we're doing, and to show leadership and to show certainty rather than to show vulnerability and say, these are the things that we are trying to achieve. We don't quite know how we're going to design it yet, because very quickly you're accused of weak leadership there versus saying, well, actually, this is how in business good decisions get done. A CEO sets a direction and says, right, this is how we're going to evolve. We're going to figure out, and we're not going to announce exactly what we'll do until we've really mastered the detail.
Look, I mean, I think it's bloody hard, because we could do better if we had a more open consultation about saying, look, directionally, this is where we believe we need to go. And here, these are some of the things that we're thinking about. Let's go through a process where people can contribute and you flesh stuff out. Because I think otherwise what you end up in, and, we're seeing a bit of this now, is, people can be on board in principle, but off on practical, because they're saying, well, I just don't agree with this design, and so on that basis, I won't support it.
These conversations are complex. Multiple things can be true at the same time. We need to take time to figure it out. How has your experience shifted as you've sort of gone from being a sort of a first-term newbie and this is all new and you're an outsider, to then being the incumbent and having to defend your seat and go, well, now I am a little bit part of the I'm still independent, but I'm now part of the establishment. Have you seen and experienced your sort of your journey changing there?
Yeah, it's interesting. In the second election, we sort of deliberately thought it's like, we still have to have that challenger mentality, because, I may be in my second term, But this seat is a Liberal seat for decades and decades and decades. So, it's a reminder that this is still different for the electorate, and it's still about being a challenger. So I think that's my that's how I think about it is, you still have to be a challenger mentality. And I guess and the other thing I learned is, one of the things about being new was that most of my team, I think no one had worked in politics before we started. So, you just did what you thought was right, and you had that kind of like, well, this seems like the right thing to do, so this is what we will do it. This is, okay, well, we want to kind of engage people. Well, let's try this. And so there's a lot of freedom and flexibility when you're an innovator. And I think it's like, and my question on my second term is how to maintain that flexibility, how not to just end up in a playbook and go, okay, well, that's what we did last year, so we'll just keep on doing that. Like, we need to disrupt ourselves in terms of what we do because things change. And because, people, to engage people, novelty is pretty important. And so, that's what people that's kind of what you need to do. So you need to do that as well as build on the successes that you have had, I think, and the knowledge that you have gained, particularly in Parliament, work more, I have much deeper relationships across the Parliament, so I can, and across the business community and other areas, so I can be much more effective in a bunch of areas. It's making sure at that local level that you don't lose that challenger mentality, you don't lose the things that people wanted in the first place, but also that you keep them evolving.
How much do you worry about the algorithm? How much do you worry that we are losing our ability to engage outside of our bubbles?
I worry a lot about that. I'm a big supporter of Fix Our Feeds campaign from Chanel Contos, which is about saying how do you make it easier for people to switch off the algorithm so they go back to content that they're following. And so I think we all need a moment to break from that. And I think we need to do more in real life. There's this group called Brave Conversations out of Monash University. There's two academics who are saying that we actually need to work out how to not, find the surface agreement, but actually find the deeper disagreements, have a disagreement and do that well and come away with respect and, understanding, even if we continue to disagree. So, and they're sort of really about how do we teach that structure in our education systems and others. So we're actually hosting them to do some work in the community, both with some of our educators, some of our school principals and teams. And then we've also opened that up to the broader community as well as, invited community leaders, because in real life, we need to be able to sit down and disagree and listen to each other and come away with empathy and respect. And if we can do that, then we are stronger. But I think we need to, so I worry about the algorithms, and I think that, and I worry about how AI will change us. And I was saying to, again, the kids last night, I think in real life is going to be more and more important than ever. And so we need to invest in doing it well in real life.
I could not agree with you more. And I'm just interested in your view, the algorithms and then the compounding impact that AI is going to have. It sometimes feels to me almost impossible to talk about this stuff with appropriate gravity without starting to sound like a conspiracy theorist. I think I was explaining to my mother the other night about this idea that you've got to recognize that when all these services and platforms are free, it's because we and our attention are the product. It's our eyeballs, it's our dopamine that's being hacked, that's being monetized. And you sort of start to realize you're sounding like a sort of 1970s raving conspiracy theorist, but you're actually just trying to lay out the extent to which our attention and our feeds are being hacked and being corrupted. Do you you're obviously an incredibly smart person. You've got the McKinsey training, you've got the ability to see things as they are. Do you ever sort of sometimes go, am I over or under communicating how profoundly our world is changing thanks to technology?
Yeah, it's interesting. I think this is the question on AI. Like, for me, that's a massive. It's going to make a massive change. Now, I don't want to be alarmist, and by nature, I'm an optimistic person, and so I go. I think there are really significant upsides. And I also think that this is not something we can hold back. This is not something that, and if we sort of put in legislation, so you're saying, oh, you can't have AI job losses, we will just see a whole part of our economy go offshore where they will do everything on AI and they will sell products back into this country. This is an area where we actually have to have a Team Australia moment and really be working constructively in this space. But I think so that's that. But I think it's going to profoundly change us. And it's like, how do you have a conversation that is neither panicking nor, falsely optimistic, or sort of say rose-coloured glasses, because neither of those two things are right. And the truth is we actually don't know how AI is evolving, and it's an evolution. And most people don't want that uncertainty, but that's the way it is. So I don't know the answer to that. I'm just alive to the challenge.
I don't think Allegra Spender is the only person who doesn't have all the answers when it comes to AI and what it is doing and what it's going to do to our politics, our society, our culture. But it's great to hear her engaging with the questions, engaging with the issues, just as it's great to hear her engaging with the complexity and at times the controversy of something as difficult as tax reform. But then there are moments in a political life when you don't have a choice. And I should warn you, we're about to talk about the tragic events that took place in Bondi in December of last year, when 15 people lost their lives in a horrific terrorist attack targeting Sydney's Jewish community. At that moment, as a local leader, Allegra didn't have a choice. She didn't have all the answers, but she did have to step up. Sometimes you don't have a choice, and I'm thinking about, particularly the tragedy that occurred in Bondi, which is part of your constituency. And you talked earlier in the podcast about the need to lead with both head and heart. When we chatted before we recorded, you talked about the need to balance sometimes being hard and being soft, and bringing that vulnerability and that empathy. What did you learn about your leadership style and the needs from leadership in those moments following Bondi?
Look, it was incredibly hard. And I think, the community is still devastated. And for the Jewish community, life will never be the same again for many of the Jews who live in my electorate and also in Australia. Like, it's shattered what they sense of this. So this it's very deep in terms of what has changed. I think what I learned from this, a couple of things. One was that, leaders are about showing up. And I think that's about one of the things I did for the week, certainly after Bondi, was I was at the memorial every day just listening to people. And, some people were angry, some people were sad, some people were angry at me. Some people, were frustrated, they were scared. There were all these emotions. And I think part of leadership is particularly in a local level, it's actually being there and in some level absorbing that. And then it's, what I got from a lot of people is like, I don't want people to talk about politicians like a politician. I want, you got to talk like a real person. And I think this is what people want. People do want you to be a real person first. They accept that you have a job and they do want you to lead, but they do want you to be a person. When it comes to it, however, like being empathetic and vulnerable is great, but you actually have to keep people safe. And that's what I mean. You have to be strong and soft. Like, we do need protections. We do need the policing to be right. We do need our security services to be right. We need to look very hard at what happened and what can we do, and not everything's in our control, to prevent this happening in the future. But also we can't leave, with all that sort of strength, destroy what it is actually to be Australian, which is that sort of, you meet people with curiosity rather than suspicion. And I think that's kind of the heart of what holds us together as one of the most diverse nations that has ever existed on earth. Like, it's not easy to be that, but, that we need to cultivate, and that connection at a personal level. And we need to see people as people first before we see your religion, your ethnicity, your sexuality, anything else. You're a human, I'm a human, and your choices are up to you, and so are mine. And, it's that sort of moral responsibility. So it's a very long answer, but I think these are hard things. And, but that is what I learned, is you need strength, but you also need humanity. And I think we need to remind ourselves right now to stop dehumanizing the other, because that is actually how crimes of terrorism and crimes of hate start, is with dehumanization.
I could not agree with you more strongly. I have no follow-up on that, other than to say I think you've beautifully highlighted not just the need for humanity and empathy and understanding. But I think you've highlighted something really important about leadership as well, which is we need to look to our leaders. And I think this is true for all walks of life, and see people who are like a lighthouse amongst swirling, crashing seas. Like, we need to look at them and see strength. That's why we're asking them to be leaders. One of the challenges about being a member of parliament and representing an electorate is it doesn't matter how many of them voted for you, you need to represent all of them, and you need to make that pivot from winning enough votes to get over the line to now representing 100% of your electorate. How do you sort of strike that balance in your mind?
I think it is a really important point that your job is always to represent your community regardless of whether they voted to you or not. And I think if you just remember that, I think starting with that as a genuine commitment is probably the place to start. And then I think the other side is listening. It does start with listening, and then it's trying to sort of, pull together the threads, because, the unhappy ones are always the noisy ones. So, that's always tricky. So, you hear less from, they're not completely, from the people who are happy with how the sort of direction of travel on a bunch of different things. So, but that's my probably first point is listen, and, try and approach people on the basis of, you don't care ultimately whether they voted for you or not. Like, that's your, because they're if you're not listening to your critics, then you're not listening, right? And it's not easy to listen to your critics. It's not easy to listen to the people who disagree with you, but your arguments will be better, your policies will be sharper if you actually engage.
What do you feel you have become better at than you ever imagined you would be as you've gone through this Canberra journey?
I never thought I would be this gregarious. I'm actually, I used to be quite shy. And Matt, you and I have known each other for some time. I'm naturally quite introverted. You wouldn't necessarily pick that now. And I do much more on social media. I'm quite shameless, which makes me, because I don't mind humour. I actually don't mind taking the piss of myself or being slightly comic, and I didn't know that that's how I would be, but I quite enjoy that aspect. So again, I didn't expect that kind of piece. But my mum always said, don't take yourself too seriously, and I think she might be right. I think that's a very good principle to hold to. I went to sort of, various networking things. I would literally, if you were doing that sort of drinks thing first, sometimes I would just go and hang out in the bathroom until the formal bit started, because I was so nervous about going up to groups of people, introducing myself, and feeling like I just had nothing to contribute. Like, it was really, that was in my sort of 30s. I'm not that old now, but I was very shy about. And you just felt intimidated, felt like, well, what do I have to add? And sometimes your job is just to listen. And that's what's I've learned through this, is that, all these people, including politicians who you've seen on television, and suddenly you're in the same room as them. People are people are people. And it is, the sooner you internalize that, the better. And I guess that's the other side in making the choice to run. That was the hardest decision of my life. And then I was really scared. And a big question for me was, am I the right person? Do I have the personality?
We've talked about the importance of detail and complexity, but also the importance of storytelling and vision. You just talked about being an optimist and the importance of hope and ambition. What do you think our democracy needs a bit more of, and what would you like to be responsible for injecting a bit more of?
I do my best. It's not easy. Look, I think there's a bit of optimism that we do need. I still look at any country in the world. Where would you like to be born? I think I'd still prefer to be born in Australia than anywhere else, for the balance of things that we have. And so we have a very special country. So I think we should be optimistic about ourselves. I think what we do need is, what I think we need to invest in is connections across difference. And there's this concept of bonding capital versus bridging capital, when I'm talking about social capital here. And this I think it's Putman's idea that bonding capital holds a community together, bridging capital bridges between communities. And you might just call them bubbles. And we need more bridges between our bubbles than we have now. And that's why I think actually local organisations like, surf clubs and, sort of land care and things which bring people truly, and even more so, the ones that bring people of difference together, that's the super exciting stuff. So I think more support for those kind of pieces, more actually I think responsibility in our education systems around disagreeing well, because we don't facilitate that. That should be the focus. I mean, universities, if they do nothing else, they should be actually cultivating that. And I don't think they're doing enough of the work in that deliberate cultivation.
I want to finish with something you said at the start, which is you've learned something about how gregarious you can be. And maybe younger Allegra would have told a story about herself that she wasn't really a storyteller, wasn't an out there person. And I think you've gone on a journey that I've observed in many leaders, which is when you find your passion and when you find your purpose, suddenly you realize you don't have to be abstractly gregarious. You can talk and you can fill a room with energy because suddenly you've figured out what energy you want to bring into that room. Is that sort of what you feel?
I think you're probably right. Like when I care about topics, and that does brings me joy and animates me. So I think you're right. Like I do love what I do, even on tough days.
Thanks so much, Allegra Spender.
Thanks so much, Matt.
StoryWork was brought to you in partnership with Slingshot. As you've heard in today's episode, stories really matter, and there is no story more important than the one you tell your customers. But finding the right time, place, channel, and medium through which to tell that story is critical, and that's where my great friends at Slingshot come in. Slingshot pride themselves on developing creative media strategies to propel their clients further, faster. You can find out more about the brilliant work that Slingshot does, helping brands find their audiences, tell their stories, and achieve their objectives at slingshot.com.au. And talking about finding out more, you can find out more about this and every episode of StoryWork, including all the show notes and all of my key learnings from every conversation over on Substack.